The EU warned the UK Brexit would hurt the economy, disrupt trade, and create problems you never expected. They were dismissed, but now it seems they were right all along. It's been nearly a decade since the UK voted to leave the EU, and regret is growing. The economy has lost billions, businesses are struggling, and public opinion has shifted. Brexit promised freedom and prosperity, but did it deliver? Or did the EU predict the reality Britain faces today? The UK's decision to leave the European Union wasn't just a political drama, it was a financial ticking time bomb, or so the EU warned. As the UK debated its future in the EU, Brussels repeatedly issued stark warnings, cautioning that Brexit would bring significant economic pain, not just for Britain, but also for Europe. These weren't just casual comments either, they were detailed forecasts grounded in cold, hard data. The EU's warnings centered around a few major themes: trade disruptions, investment losses, and job risks. At the heart of the argument was this simple fact: the UK's economy had been deeply intertwined with the EU for decades. From manufacturing to financial services, the UK's industries thrived on seamless access to Europe's single market, and the EU wasn't shy about pointing out what severing those ties could mean. Take trade, for instance. The EU made it clear that leaving the bloc would likely result in new tariffs, custom checks, and regulatory barriers. Brussels argued that introducing friction into this critical flow of goods would inevitably raise costs for businesses and consumers alike. For industries like automotives, agriculture, and pharmaceuticals, the EU said the shock could be devastating. And it wasn't just about goods. Services were another key concern, especially financial services. The EU warned that the City of London, one of the world's largest financial hubs, could lose its competitive edge. Why? Because Brexit risked stripping the UK of its passporting rights, which allowed financial firms in Britain to freely operate across the EU. This would force companies to either relocate or set up expensive new offices inside the bloc to keep their access to European markets. Another big warning came in the form of foreign investment. It was claimed that Brexit would make the UK a less attractive destination for global businesses. Think about it. For years, companies from around the world used the UK as a gateway to Europe, a place with English-speaking talent, a business-friendly environment, and access to 27 other countries without tariffs or trade barriers. But Brussels warned that once that gateway closed, companies might pack up and move to other EU member states like Germany, France, or the Netherlands. And then there was the issue of jobs. The EU forecasted significant job losses across multiple industries. For instance, they predicted that trade-reliant sectors like manufacturing could face major layoffs due to higher costs and reduced competitiveness. In fact, a report suggested that Brexit could threaten hundreds of thousands of jobs in both the UK and the EU, given the interconnected nature of supply chains. But the warnings didn't stop there. The EU also argued that Brexit could weaken Britain's economic resilience by leaving it isolated in an increasingly globalized world. Without the collective strength of the EU, they said, the UK would struggle to negotiate favorable trade deals with major powers like the United States, China, or India. And let's not forget the long-term implications the EU outlined. They argued that young Britons in particular would lose out. Access to opportunities like the Erasmus student exchange program, cross-border employment options, and collaboration in research projects would all be compromised. Brussels painted a picture of the UK that was not just economically weaker, but also less connected with the rest of the world. Now, whether you saw these warnings as legitimate concerns or political scare tactics probably depended on where you stood on the Brexit debate. To leave voters, these prophecies sounded like Project Fear, a coordinated campaign to intimidate people into voting Remain. But to Remainers, these warnings were common sense, a reality check on what a massive decision like Brexit could mean. While the EU's initial warnings about Brexit's economic fallout were dismissed as mere fear-mongering, hindsight tells a different story. The promises of prosperity and sovereignty have clashed with stark economic realities. Let's take a closer look at how Britain's post-Brexit journey has unfolded, with reduced trade and labour shortages at the heart of the struggle. Let's talk about what happened after the dust settled on the Brexit referendum. While the Leave campaign promised sovereignty, control over immigration, and new economic opportunities, the reality has been far harsher than many expected. The numbers don't lie. Post-Brexit Britain is feeling the economic strain, and it's playing out across every sector of the economy. Goldman Sachs recently crunched the numbers, and the results are eye-opening. Since the 2016 referendum, the UK's economy has grown 5% less than other advanced economies. That's not a small margin. It's billions wiped off GDP. In fact, Goldman estimates that Brexit has shaved somewhere between 4% and 8% of real GDP, a massive hit that can't be fully blamed on other crises like the pandemic or the energy shock of 2022. So where is this economic pain coming from? The answer boils down to three key issues: trade, investment, and labour. The UK's departure from the EU single market introduced new barriers, tariffs, custom checks, and red tape. For decades, Britain's businesses thrived on seamless access to European markets, and now that was gone. Industries like automotives and agriculture have taken major hits. London alone accounts for a staggering £30 billion in economic losses since Brexit, and across the UK that number balloons to £140 billion. But it's not just about exports and imports. Businesses are facing rising costs to navigate these new barriers, which ultimately get passed on to consumers. This, combined with slower trade, is making the UK less competitive on a global stage. Let's talk about foreign investment, a critical engine for economic growth. The EU warned this would decline after Brexit, and they were right. If you look at these graphs, in 2022, foreign direct investment (FDI) into the UK dropped to £22.9 billion. Compare that to 2016, when inward FDI flows equaled 9.6% of GDP. By 2022, they had plummeted to just 0.9%. And it's not just fewer investments coming in. The UK is also seeing disinvestment, particularly from European countries. France, for example, recorded net disinvestment of $41.3 billion in 2022. The reasons are clear: a small domestic market, reduced access to European talent, and ongoing uncertainty around trade policies have made the UK less appealing to global businesses. The trend isn't isolated either. It's part of a broader, long-term decline, but Brexit has undeniably amplified the drop, leaving the UK struggling to compete with European neighbours like France and Germany, who continue to attract more investors. One of the most immediate and visible impacts of Brexit has been the labour market crisis. Ending free movements with the EU cut off a vital pipeline of workers, especially in sectors that relied heavily on EU nationals. Post-Brexit, these workers were the backbone of industries like agriculture, healthcare, and hospitality. Post-Brexit, the story is very different. The UK's workforce is short by about 330,000 people compared to what it might have been under the old system. Agriculture is perhaps the hardest hit. Farmers are struggling to find enough seasonal workers, leaving crops to rot in the fields. In healthcare, the NHS is facing an even bigger staffing crisis than before, unable to recruit enough nurses and doctors. The losses are staggering. In transportation and storage, 128,000 workers are gone. That's 8% of the sector's workforce. Wholesale and retail, down by 103,000 workers. Accommodation and food services have lost 67,000 workers, while manufacturing and construction are each short tens of thousands. Yes, the UK has tried to offset some of this by attracting non-EU workers, about 130,000 to be precise, but it's nowhere near enough to fill the gap. The result? Rising costs, low productivity, and critical shortages across essential services. The economic toll of Brexit isn't just about numbers, it's about what they represent. Slower growth, declining investment, and labour shortages all point to an economy struggling to find its footing outside the EU. The promise of a stronger, more independent Britain hasn't materialised, at least not yet. As public sentiments shift and regret grows, the economic ripple effects of Brexit continue to reshape key sectors. From plummeting trade with the EU to a struggling automotive industry, the challenges are far-reaching. Let's examine how Brexit has transformed trade and industry in the UK and the mixed outcomes of global trade ventures. Before Brexit, the UK enjoyed seamless trade with the EU single market and customs union, but as the EU had warned, leaving this framework would introduce significant barriers, and that's exactly what happened. Custom checks, tariffs, and regulatory hurdles have hit the UK businesses hard. Between 2021 and 2023, UK exports to the EU dropped by 27%, while imports fell by 32%. These aren't minor dips, they're seismic collapses in trade volumes. Smaller businesses have been hit the hardest. Out of 100,000 firms analysed, 14,000 completely stopped trading with EU nations within just 2 years. Why? The sheer burden of additional paperwork, customs duties, and compliance costs made it impossible for many to continue. For example, businesses now must navigate rules of origin certifications and value-added tax payments, turning what was once a streamlined process into a logistical nightmare. And let's not forget supply chains. Industries like automotive and food production have faced soaring costs and severe disruptions. For instance, ensuring food safety and authenticity has become more complicated and expensive, driving up prices, costs that are ultimately passed on to consumers. For low-income households, this has been especially brutal. Now, while smaller players struggle, larger firms have fared better. Many have found ways to adapt, maintaining their trade volumes, but this has highlighted an uneven playing field. The divide between the haves and have-nots in the business world has grown wider. But what about the broader strategy? Brexit gave the UK the freedom to forge its own trade deals, and while the government has signed agreements with countries like Australia, Canada, and Japan, the economic benefits haven't quite lived up to the hype. Trade openness, a measure of how much a nation imports and exports relative to its GDP, has actually declined since Brexit. By 2021, the UK's trade openness had dropped 3 percentage points compared to 2019. In contrast, France saw a slight increase during the same period. Now, let's zoom in on the automotive industry, a sector that once symbolized British manufacturing strength. The numbers are grim. In 2022, the UK produced just 775,000.14 cars, a staggering 41% decline from 2019. This marks the lowest production level since 1956. Why is this happening? One major factor is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU. Under its rules, electric vehicles must meet stringent rules of origin requirements to avoid tariffs. By 2027, 55% of cars' components must come from the UK or EU, a threshold that's nearly impossible for UK manufacturers reliant on Chinese-made batteries. Major automakers like Stellantis, Jaguar Land Rover, and Ford have issued warnings. Stellantis, which owns brands like Peugeot and Vauxhall, have even hinted at pulling out of the UK unless these trade rules are renegotiated. The stakes are huge, with over 5,000 jobs hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, the EU is surging ahead. France has invested billions into building a battery valley, attracting major players like Taiwanese battery makers Prologium. In contrast, the UK's efforts, such as the ill-fated British Volt project, have faltered. British Volt collapsed under £120 million worth of debt, a symbol of the UK struggling to compete on a global stage. Adding insult to injury, manufacturers like Honda and Ford have already shut down plants in Swindon and Bridgend. By 2028, Jaguar Land Rover and Nissan might be the only major car makers left in the UK. The broader picture is equally challenging. While the UK's services sector has shown resilience, service exports to the EU were 9% higher in 2023 compared to 2019. Goods trades remained a weak point. Brexit has reshaped the UK's economy in profound ways. Trade barriers, a shrinking automotive industry, and underwhelming global trade deals have left the country grappling with economic uncertainty. The question remains, how will the UK adapt to this new reality? Well, let's explore what lies ahead on this uncharted road. Brexit is done, but is the story really over? Not quite. The fallout from leaving the EU has left many in the UK grappling with rising costs, political instability, and strained trade ties. But as frustration simmers, the focus is shifting from regret to solutions. The question now is, what does the future hold for the UK and its relationship with the EU? Let's start with progress already made. The UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, signed in the late 2020, defined the post-Brexit relationship in areas like trade, judicial cooperation, and intellectual property. Fast forward to February 2023, and the Windsor Framework further eased tensions by addressing Northern Ireland's unique challenges. These milestones show that despite Brexit's initial turbulence, collaboration is not only possible, it's already happening. And it doesn't stop there. In 2023, the UK rejoined Horizon Europe and Copernicus, key EU programs focusing on research and innovation. Agreements like the North Seas Energy Cooperation are advancing joint efforts in renewable energy. These moves signal a growing realization. In a world facing complex challenges, the UK and EU need each other. Still, it's not all smooth sailing. The economic toll of Brexit is undeniable. Rising import costs are driving up household bills, and businesses face mountains of red tape. Yet public sentiment is evolving. Polls show a growing desire for closer ties with the EU, not necessarily to rejoin, but to rebuild a cooperative relationship that benefits both sides. So what's next? Exports are proposing a special partnership, a middle ground that deepens economic and political cooperation without reversing Brexit. This can include aligning UK regulations with EU standards to simplify trade, boosting mobility agreements for professionals and youth, and linking emissions trade systems to reduce energy costs. Security is another key area. Enhanced cooperation on law enforcement and criminal justice could strengthen both sides. The goal isn't to rewrite Brexit, but to reimagine its potential. By focusing on shared interests, the UK and EU can craft a future that benefits both parties while leaving the door open for future generations to shape their destiny. It's not just about fixing what's broken, it's about building something better. The road ahead is long, but is it one worth travelling?